Okay, so hi everyone. So we will be speaking, I think, English until the end of the day. I'm presenting today a few preliminary thoughts on governance and what is called algorithmic governance. But I would like first reply to a question that you might have. Why am I, as a lawyer, why am I, as a professor of law, interested in governance issues? Why don't I leave that to computer scientists, to economists, to blockchain experts, which I'm not? Well, what I would like to show, what I would like to say here is that we lawyers, we jurists are actually very much concerned by governance issues. And to illustrate this, I would like to take an example that was given by Max Gulker, who is a research fellow from the American Institute for Economic Research. And he made, in an article, a very insightful comparison between the existing Bitcoin platform and an imaginary Bitcoin platform that would be run by a legal entity that is called Bitcoin Incorporated. So Bitcoin Incorporated would be a corporation that owns the platform and controls it. So the platform run by Bitcoin Incorporated would be a public blockchain. The code would be open source. It would be written by third-party developers. The system would be run by open mining, meaning that anyone could become a miner on the blockchain, but it would be centralized. Bitcoin Incorporated would design the platform, would make the decisions about change to the code, would probably be in charge of disputes, and would make profit by charging a small transaction fee. So in such a configuration, Bitcoin Incorporated would be a service provider. If users are not satisfied, they can leave the platform and stop using the token. And as a service provider, Bitcoin Incorporated would be liable if a problem arises on the platform. We could also imagine that Bitcoin Incorporated would be insured for any problem that could happen. So in such a configuration, Bitcoin Incorporated would play the role of a trusted third party. And this is something that the law is accustomed to. On the other hand, this is not the way that the Bitcoin blockchain looks like today, since it is fully decentralized. So no one controls it. Modifying the Bitcoin's code is not easy. As you probably know, it requires that some developers make a proposal. They write a new open source code, and once the new code is adopted, the blockchain database must fork, meaning that it branches into two blockchains, one with a change and one without the change, and each miner, each node is responsible for running the new code. So here, the situation is very different, and from a legal perspective, it changes everything. Why? No one there is in charge of solving issues, in principle. There is no one that you can talk to, even though you might communicate with people on some networks, but there is no one in charge. And of course, there is no one that is liable if there is an adverse event that occurs. and there is no one that is insured for this, it is even very hard to determine the applicable law. So we know that decentralization is considered as desirable. We know some people think that it can help us avoid corrupted institutions. It would create less power asymmetries, and there would be no issues with arbitrarism, corruption, inconsistencies, etc. However, we're facing all those questions that I've mentioned, and then for lawyers, there is really a problem. There is a problem, especially when lawmakers have to draft new regulations. And you probably know that the French government is considering regulating ICO, which is probably different stories, but it is also about to allow financial titles to be traded on blockchain platforms. So if those blockchain platforms are controlled by specific intermediaries, specific trust parties like banks, then we are in a very traditional configuration. But if the French government really wants to allow transactions involving financial title to be traded on decentralized blockchains, then we need to give, and the government the lawmakers must give more precisions about how those public blockchains should be run. And accepting that the transactions that occur on decentralized platform have a legal effect is not only a true challenge, but it requires to look deeply into the way decentralized blockchains work. So is it something that lawmakers should do, looking at decentralized blockchains and determine which decentralized blockchain are legally acceptable? And this is the question I actually want to raise today. I don't have the solution. I don't have the answer to this. But we could imagine that the law gives precisions about how decentralized blockchains should be governed for the law to accept them, or for them to be given or recognized a legal effect. So we could find certain requirements about governance in the law, but this would have no meaning if those requirements were only drafted in a national law. We know that blockchains are transnational. So maybe we should think of an international law of blockchains that could be drafted, and that would include general principles of governance that should be followed by all decentralized blockchain platforms. And let's imagine that those general principles of blockchain platforms would be considered as having a contractual nature. So everyone that goes on a decentralized platform is assumed to have accepted those principles. Then we could also think of creating specific insurance schemes, maybe for users, since there is no one that is liable. But then, before doing that, we must deeply think of governance, of course. We must have more precision about what governance is and what the governance issues are. So what is governance about? Governance is about how the original protocol is designed. It is also about who exercises power on the platform according to the protocol, and it is also, and it is a very problematic point, it is also what decides how the original protocol may be changed, since we all agree that the platform must adapt to the change of circumstances. So in those platforms, you find an order that is for the moment considered as an order without law. Some people talk about lex cryptographia, understood as private regulatory frameworks. But those rules deal with those three issues. So who is given power on those three issues? Well, those who design the blockchain platform usually don't keep the power, even though it could be challenged. But in the example of Satoshi Nakamoto, he basically disappeared. He probably died. No one has heard of him. It's probably a little bit different with Ethereum, since you know that the Ethereum Foundation has an enormous power and an enormous influence over the evolution of the platform. Then, on the platform itself, you have people that are given power to run the platform through the consensus protocol, and you probably know the various, and I've given on my slide a few examples of consensus protocols. You have more of them, but the most important ones are the proof of work, the proof of stake, the proof of space. But the main question for us is making change. Who is in charge to make change once it is accepted that, as Fred Esham said, like organism, the ability of blockchain to succeed over time is based on its ability to evolve. And those change decisions may relate to changing the protocol, changing the size of the blocks, for example. They can also involve rewriting price transactions, which is, as you know, very controversial, but it's a very important decision, as we know through the example of the DAO. So, of course, you always have obstacles, limits to change, even if a change is decided. Why? Well, because you might have people that don't agree with the change, and those people may fork, may decide not to stay with the current blockchain. All that being said, who is able to change the code? Well, on the Bitcoin protocol, it is basically, there is a possibility to suggest improvements, to make Bitcoin improvement proposals. But as you probably know, only core developers have the password to change the code, to change the Bitcoin core. So is that a platform that is that decentralized? And the Ethereum protocol, the Ethereum Foundation is very influential. But as you probably know, and as I mentioned, in the DAO case, it is the Ether holders that voted by sending a transaction to a voting platform. So are those protocols, are those systems good? Should they be improved? Well, there is actually an important debate that is going on by people who are in favor of what is called on-chain governance, where the governance is made by the infrastructure. So it would be governance through code, governance through smart contracts. So this is truly algorithmic governance. And on the other side of the spectrum, you might find people that are strongly in favor of off-chain governance. Then, in that case, governance decisions are made off the infrastructure, outside of the infrastructure, but sometimes within the community, like the example of Bitcoin improvement proposals. One of the strongest advocates of off-chain governance is Vlad Zamfir, who is the principal architect of the Ethereum's proof of stake. And he thinks that on-chain governance is risky. It represents an extremely risky proposition because it means that blockchain nodes automatically upgrade when an on-chain governance process decides on an upgrade. So here there's still a debate going on, and of course Vitalik Buterin made a few comments on this, saying that, well, the current informal governance is not that bad, but also highlighting that what he calls multifactorial consensus should be promoted. So you have various factors that are suggested by Buterin that should be taken into account to reach consensus and to govern the platform. So you might find various positions. You have some people like Fred Esham that see the blockchain Bitcoin as a kind of democracy. You might here find a drawing that shows the Bitcoin platform through the eyes of the American Constitution. Well, this is interesting because you can see that the developers are the Senate, miners are the judiciary, and the nodes are the executive branch. And Esham says, similar to citizens, the users can revolt. So I think it could be challenged. This way of seeing the Bitcoin protocol could be challenged, but it's an interesting way to look at governance. You have, of course, other examples like the Tezos platform. So my slide is in French. Anyway, so anyone can propose on the Tezos platform, anyone can propose a change in the form of a code update. And then there is an on-chain vote. So this is a true on-chain governance mechanism. So there is an on-chain vote on the update, and if passed, the update is tested. And then after a certain period of time on the test network, a confirmation vote occurs. So it's an interesting mechanism. You have another one, you have plenty of them actually, but another one that I mentioned here, which is Definity. So on-chain votes is also allowed, and you can, here in this case, make retroactive changes to the ledger, rewrite past transactions. So you have today many models that are being discussed, like Footarchy, like liquid democracy, quadratic voting, meritocratic governance models. But here there is a deep reflection that should probably be driven on all those issues. Maybe the main question is to avoid bad equilibria. So in conclusion, I would like to raise two questions. My first one that I already mentioned, should lawmakers determine specific governance requirements, whatever it is, on-chain governance mechanisms, off-chain, giving the power to users or to certain developers, whatever it is. And then if we agree that we should probably give precisions about governance on decentralized blockchain, so what should be the goals by determining those governance principles? Should they be democracy? Should they be cybersecurity? Efficiency is a very important aspect. Should they be compliance with the law? So should the governance system be designed such as the entire system would be compliant. So those are mostly questions, not answers, and of course I'm sorry for this. But I would like to finish with a quote from Buterin, which I actually like very much. He wrote, "People who think that the purpose of blockchains is to completely expunge soft, mushy human intuitions and feelings in favor of completely algorithmic governance, emphasis on completely, are absolutely crazy." Thanks.
More questions to Florence at the end of the panel. We can do it. So, who has a question? Yes, please.
Hi. So you talk about governance on-chain, and when you do so, you talk about users. How do you really qualify a user? How do you define it? Because we tend to think, oh, user equals person, but technically, anybody could write a bot with millions of addresses and vote with these, right? So how do you define this yourself?
Well, I don't have any. It is an issue. So I'm not someone that have a very precise idea that this is one of the issues that should probably be solved. Usually, you will suppose that users are basically token holders, but of course there might be another way to look at that. So I don't have any definitive reply to this.
Yeah, thanks. And in continuation to that question you've just asked, so on a slide you mentioned 4 types of voting, or I don't know how to call it. You have futarchy, quadratic thingy, I don't know what. Can you come back to that and explain us, for example, that last one, the quadratic thing you mentioned? Because it sounds like very linked to what to the last question, and yet it was quite arcane.
Yes, sure. Let me go back to my slide. So I had to be actually quick because we are running out of time. So let's say a few words about those possible models that are currently being advocated by a few experts. In the futarchy regime, the idea is that you will ask citizens or users what their values are and how satisfied they are. So you will make them decide about very general goals, and then you will try to implement the measures, the changes that are necessary to reach those goals. And this is here. This picture represents that a mechanism. So there is a question: should we fire the CEO? And then the answer is given by looking at predictions. Okay, so this is how we could deal with this. More specifically here, you could have a citizen that is, citizens could be polled once a year and ask the question, how satisfied have you been this year on a scale from 0 to 1? Then you have an overall welfare, societal welfare score, and you might develop a prediction market regarding this. So if you have a new reform, a new bill, and it is introduced, then there is a 1 week period where market can speculate on whether the overall welfare score will go up and down thanks to that reform. And if actually the overall welfare goes up, then the traders who bet on that own the contracts they bet on. So this is a whole mechanism that is based on betting and making predictions. Liquid democracy. Well, liquid democracy is basically a system where everyone has the ability to vote or to delegate to someone else the voting. Quadratic voting is actually pretty interesting, and it has been sophisticated by economists, by several economists. But it's a system of buying votes where each additional vote costs twice as much as the one before it. So money buys vote, but it's more and more expensive. You have also meritocratic governance models where votes are weighed according to the reputation of voters. So these are only ideas and proposals. No one knows if it's practically speaking it could work.
Maybe a last quick question.
Thank you. When you talk about lawmakers, I assume that you talk about domestic national lawmakers, whereas my understanding is that blockchain is by nature transnational. So
absolutely. Well, that's the reason for which I mentioned the possibility of drafting international principles. I am actually thinking of the principe unidroit, the unidroit principle, that you can choose when you conclude a contract. And that's the kind of idea that I have, that like saying, well, if you decide to use a certain platform that is decentralized, then you're supposed to agree for those general principles to be applied to you. And you know, then there would be, then going to the platform would be agreeing to some kind of contract. It wouldn't be going to some deregulated environment or non-regulated environment. There would be a contract around that. But that's only is absolutely a soft regulation, absolutely.
Okay, so maybe we switch on to the next talk by Jérôme de Tichère.